I spent years believing the sky belonged only to science, that wings flew because I calculated every detail, every part, every curve. But it was mid-flight, when logic failed and a greater sign appeared before my eyes, that I realized no engineering could hold my soul. That moment redefined everything I thought I knew about life, faith, and truth. My name is Rajiv Sharma. I'm 50 years old, and I live in the United States. I was born into an Indian family that valued effort, discipline, and education as honorable paths. I followed that road from a young age and became an aerospace engineer, a profession that gave me access to the largest aircraft factories in the world. I spent decades surrounded by calculations, equations, and prototypes, believing that nothing escaped reason and that the sky was just another frontier engineering could conquer. But life showed me that no design can explain everything. In the heart of a turbulent flight, with hundreds of passengers looking at me as if logic could save them, I discovered that science was not enough. It was in that moment that I began to see there is something greater than any formula, and that realization opened the door to the transformation I will share here. Before continuing with my conversion story, write in the comments where you are watching from. I want to know how far this testimony is reaching. Over the years, engineering became both my refuge and my prison. I lived to deliver results. Each new aircraft design had to be lighter, safer, more efficient. I worked on reports with dozens of pages, endless meetings with executives, and presentations in front of politicians who saw our planes as symbols of power. This routine gave me status, international travel, and salaries that supported an enviable lifestyle. I felt important, almost untouchable, because my work influenced decisions that crossed borders. With every contract signed, I fed the pride of believing my intelligence was enough to explain the world. On the outside, it looked like absolute success. On the inside, however, the reality was very different. In the silence of my home, I became a stranger even to my own family. My wife tried to talk about values, about raising children, about what it meant to build something beyond full bank accounts. I didn't know what to answer. My children asked for guidance that went beyond math. They asked for direction on how to deal with frustration, fear, and uncertainty about the future. I, who solved complex equations and mapped out flight paths for thousands of miles, didn't have a single solid word to give them. That inability ate away at me. The contrast between the celebrated engineer and the empty man was cruel. I clung to numbers because at least there were no unanswered questions. Science gave me certainty, but life demanded something I didn't have. Many nights I sat in my office, staring at diplomas on the wall, questioning what success really meant. What kind of victory was this that didn't fulfill me, that didn't bring me closer to those I loved most? Deep down, I knew my technical arrogance was a mask. It served to hide the fear of admitting I had no control over the most essential things. I could stabilize planes, but how do you stabilize a restless soul? How do you calculate the weight of silence in a home that no longer believed in my presence? I pretended I was too busy, that the world depended on my work. In truth, it was cowardice, avoiding the questions that echoed inside me. That emptiness didn't appear suddenly. It grew quietly, like a structural fault no one notices until it becomes irreversible. I was a specialist in predicting failures in mechanical systems, yet I didn't see the gradual collapse of my own inner life. And it was that invisible crack, ignored for so long, that one day became impossible to sustain. I just never imagined the truth would come in such a powerful way, inside an airplane, through something no formula could ever explain. Before continuing, I want to say that during this period I learned that Allah asks us to care not only for faith, but also for the body He entrusted to us. That's why I want to recommend something that can help, a practical guide on healthy living, including how to maintain discipline, energy, and balance. And as an additional gift, this material also includes a special guide on ruqya and spiritual protection to strengthen not only the body, but also the heart. The images of 2001 remain alive in my memory, as if they happened yesterday. The day the blue sky over New York turned into smoke and dust was also the day my confidence in the world collapsed. I wasn't there physically, but every second of that morning cut through me in a brutal way. Company phones rang non-stop, emergency meetings were called, and suddenly we engineers became secondary characters in an unprecedented tragedy. The government wanted quick answers. How could modern planes be used as weapons? Where had the systems failed? How could it be prevented from happening again? I was called to join technical groups that simulated attack scenarios, analyzed data, designed structural reinforcements, and discussed new cockpit protocols. While the media showed images of wreckage and bodies, I was stuck with spreadsheets trying to rationalize the irrational. But no equation could translate the cries of desperate families. With every report finished, I didn't feel relief, only a growing weight. And that weight, without me realizing, began turning into something darker. As the months passed, I noticed I no longer saw people of Arab or Muslim origin as ordinary citizens. Every beard, every hijab, every Arabic greeting became, to me, a synonym for threat. The collective trauma blended with my personal pain and fueled a prejudice that grew silently. I told myself it was only caution, but in truth it was fear disguised as hatred. At work, the wound was hidden behind professionalism. I spoke of strengthening systems and preventing vulnerabilities, but deep down I carried a stigma. Anything connected to Islam seemed like a potential enemy. In airports, I watched passengers with selective suspicion. When Muslims prayed quietly before boarding, I interpreted it as something suspicious. It was as if my eyes had been programmed to see danger where there was only faith. This filter tainted not only the way I saw strangers, but also the way I spoke at home. Bitter comments slipped out at dinner. Arguments arose when my wife warned me I was exaggerating, and my young children absorbed it without understanding why. I wasn't only shouting against terrorism, I was shouting against an entire people, and that, I now understand, slowly eroded my humanity. The paradox was cruel. I, who had dedicated my life to building machines to bring cultures together, shorten distances, and connect continents, was cultivating within me a vast divide. Engineering had taught me to calculate tolerances, predict wear, and reinforce structures to withstand impact. But my own heart was fragile, corroded by an intolerance that refused revision. September 11th had become the yardstick by which I measured an entire religion, as if billions of people were accomplices to the pain that struck me that day. I spent years like that, without realizing how much that open wound defined my reactions. To the world, I was a respected engineer, consulted at conferences and listened to by executives. But inside there was a man scarred, suspicious, ready to build invisible walls against neighbors, colleagues or strangers who simply carried a different faith. That distorted lens became so natural that I no longer distinguished reality from paranoia, and yet life kept placing me face to face with those I feared. In every airport, on every flight, in every global project, I was forced to cross paths with Muslims. And without realizing it, that constant presence would years later begin to confront the prejudice I had silently nurtured. The trauma of 2001 had not only changed the history of the United States, it had forever altered the internal map of my soul, and sooner or later, that map would be redrawn in a way I could never have imagined. It was the beginning of 2019 when I was assigned to accompany an experimental flight between Seattle and Dubai. The mission seemed routine, to test a set of new onboard systems that promised to improve efficiency and safety on long routes. As the engineer responsible for part of the analysis, I boarded with confidence, used to trusting blindly in the algorithms, sensors, and technical reports that dominated my daily life. To me, nothing escaped the scrutiny of mathematics. Every variable could be predicted, every risk minimized. During the first few hours, everything went as planned. The panel showed stability, fuel consumption was within expectations, and the crew behaved calmly. I observed every graph with the detachment of someone who had repeated that process dozens of times. It was just another verification before the model was delivered to international companies, until, while flying over an apparently calm area, the unexpected happened. Without warning, a violent turbulence shook the plane. It wasn't the usual bump, the kind passengers soon forget. The impact was strong enough to throw cups to the floor, shake the overhead bins, and draw restrained cries from the crew. I gripped the armrest tightly, trying to keep my composure. While the sensors showed the structure was holding without problems, my body reacted as if we were about to plunge. I checked the calculations, reviewed the parameters, and objectively, there was no danger. The fuselage was within limits, altitude was stable, and the engines were operating normally. But none of that technical information could calm my heart. For the first time, I realized numbers don't comfort those who feel real fear. I saw panic in the eyes of some crew members and understood that logic doesn't reach the soul. At that moment, a crack opened inside me. I, who had built my identity on absolute trust in science and engineering, realized there was a space no equation could fill. It was as if the plane carried two parallel realities. On the instruments, everything was safe. In human experience, everything was threatening. And I was trapped between those two worlds. When the turbulence ended, the cabin returned to its normal rhythm. The captain made a brief announcement, assuring there was no reason to worry. But inside me, something was already different. I kept recording data, filling reports, and confirming that the systems had worked as expected. On the outside, I maintained the posture of the expert. On the inside, I felt a fracture growing. When we landed in Dubai, the team celebrated the success of the test. I also smiled, shook hands, and joined the official photo. But that night, alone in the hotel room, I replayed every second of the turbulence in my mind. Why, even with all indicators under control, was the fear so intense? Why didn't my heart believe what my mind assured me was safe? For the first time in years, I had no answer. That question began to follow me like a shadow. It wasn't only about flight safety. It was about life itself. If mathematics couldn't calm my spirit in the face of a threat, maybe there was another dimension I had been ignoring. Something not measured in reports, but in trust, purpose, and meaning. The 2019 flight ended safely, but it was there that I began to realize my soul no longer flew in peace. Days after that test flight, while I was still trying to shake off the sense of fracture that had taken hold inside me, I received news that part of the team would run another evaluation on a different experimental leg. It was one of those missions that brought together engineers from different sectors, test pilots, software designers, and maintenance technicians. I was there as a senior evaluator, carrying the responsibility of validating systems worth millions. It was in that context that I met Youssef, a young Muslim technician responsible for overseeing part of the maintenance during the flight. He wasn't my age and didn't have my experience, but there was something about him that stood out. While everyone spoke of calculations, protocols, and manuals, he carried himself with a calmness almost too serene for that high-pressure environment. I, accustomed to distrusting any expression of religion, looked at him with disdain when I noticed he discreetly carried a small folded prayer mat in his backpack. Takeoff went smoothly. Hours later, while flying over a region of atmospheric instability, the plane once again faced unexpected jolts. It was as if the previous episode was repeating itself. The graphs showed there was no real risk, but the unease returned, not only for me, but for the crew as well. That was when Youssef asked for permission to step into the cockpit. I could have refused, after all. His role was only technical support. But perhaps out of impulse or fatigue, I allowed him to come closer. With a calm voice, he suggested small adjustments to speed and altitude, explaining that he had seen similar turbulence on other routes and that those changes could reduce the impact. His words didn't sound like technical impositions, but rather advice from someone who wanted to care. The pilots followed his guidance, and little by little the jolts subsided. In that moment, Youssef softly recited something in Arabic. I, who had always dismissed demonstrations of faith, felt my body respond strangely. My rational mind said there was no power in that prayer, but my eyes saw a different picture. The crew, tense just moments before, relaxed as they observed his serenity. It wasn't the panel that transmitted confidence. It was that young man in a simple uniform whose calmness seemed to spread throughout the cabin. While the monitors confirmed stability, I wrestled with a new feeling. How could a 19-year-old without decades of experience or academic titles inspire more confidence than 1,000-page reports? Why did his short words, accompanied by a whispered prayer, seem to have more effect than any calculation I could present? The flight continued smoothly to its destination. When we disembarked, I noticed many thanked Youssef before even greeting the pilots. He smiled shyly, never taking credit, only saying, "Thank God, we arrived safely." I watched from a distance, trying to make sense of what I had witnessed. My logic insisted it was all due to the technical adjustments, but something in me knew it wasn't just that. That night in the hotel, I couldn't rest. The images replayed in my mind, the crew's confident eyes, the Arabic murmurs, the inexplicable calm in the midst of chaos. I asked myself if I was projecting weakness, if it was only the result of accumulated tension. Even so, one question wouldn't leave me. Why among so many engineers and specialists was it that young Muslim who brought peace to the environment? The answer didn't come right away. Still, that scene planted something in me, a seed that went against everything I had built over the years, the belief that only science sustained life. I realized, against my will, that perhaps there was a dimension beyond numbers, accessible only to those who lived with faith. In the days that followed, I tried to ignore it. I went back to reports, analyses, and technical meetings, but no matter how hard I tried, the memory of that unlikely encounter kept returning. In the middle of the noise of calculations and the voices of engineers, the image of Youssef in silence reciting his prayer continued to echo inside me. And so, without noticing, I began to see faith not as an unnecessary accessory, but as a force I still didn't understand. I didn't know where it would take me, but I sensed that it wouldn't be the last time God would use someone unexpected to shake my certainties. Coming home after days on test routes always left me exhausted, but that time I couldn't rest. The episode with Youssef had already shaken my technical foundations, yet I clung to the excuse that it had all been coincidence. After all, that was what I knew how to explain. But during another inspection flight weeks later, something happened that left me with no argument at all. The weather forecast indicated severe instability over the Pacific. Reports had been cross-checked, satellites confirmed dense formations, and radars pointed to wide areas of storms. Everything in my engineering background told me we would face just another routine turbulence, nothing unpredictable. Even so, there was a weight in the air, as if the cabin carried a silent expectation that something greater was about to unfold. At a certain point, the plane entered a compact mass of dark clouds. Lightning split the sky, and the radar flashed red in almost every direction. I monitored the numbers obsessively, repeating to myself that we were within limits. The crew, however, didn't show the same calm. There were tense looks, shallow breaths, as if every jolt was a prelude to disaster. Suddenly, in the midst of total darkness, an improbable opening appeared. A corridor of light cut through the storm and illuminated only the fuselage of our aircraft. It wasn't a normal lightning strike, nor an expected reflection. It was as if a window had opened in the sky just to follow us. The screens showed nothing. No satellite, no weather report, no known pattern described what we were seeing. Silence filled the cabin. For moments no one breathed loudly. No one dared to break the mystery. Even the engines seemed to hum in harmony with that light surrounding us. The sensation was of being suspended in another dimension, protected by something that didn't fit into technical protocols. I looked at Youssef, who watched the brightness with a face of serene gratitude. His lips moved quietly, repeating verses I didn't understand, but that sounded like acknowledgement that it wasn't mere chance. It was then that something surprising happened to me. The same words he murmured in Arabic, without my rational mind understanding them, echoed inside my head in my own language. It was as if that prayer had crossed language barriers and was meant for me too. The phrase resounded with force. He is the guardian, the protector. A shiver ran through me, not of fear but of a certainty no equation could dispute. As the crew breathed with relief, looking out the window at the beam of light moving with us, I remained still, trying to absorb what I was feeling. For the first time, I understood what it meant to stand before something that defies human logic. My mind, trained for calculations, didn't know how to interpret it, but my heart recognized there was a message, a call. The opening in the clouds lasted a few minutes, long enough for us to cross the storm's most critical area. As soon as the aircraft reached more stable air, the brightness disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, leaving behind only the usual grey sky. The later reports confirmed no other plane on that route recorded the phenomenon. It was as if it had been reserved only for us. From that moment, something began to break inside me. Until then, I had seen Youssef's faith as a cultural detail. But now, faced with that experience, I could no longer treat it as folklore or superstition. I had witnessed a sign, an act of mercy from a place science cannot reach. Upon landing, no one said much about what had happened. It was as if everyone feared sounding ridiculous by trying to explain it. But for me, the struggle was just beginning. Logic wanted to dismiss the episode as a visual illusion, an improbable atmospheric reflection. My heart, however, insisted on another interpretation. Perhaps it was the answer to a prayer I had never made, but that somehow had reached me. That night in the hotel room, I closed my eyes and still saw the light surrounding the plane. I repeated in my mind the phrase I had heard within me, "He is the guardian, the protector," as if it were a code engraved deep inside. For the first time, I felt the urge to give thanks, without knowing exactly to whom my words should be directed. And that was the point when I realized the crack that had begun in my technical pride was now becoming an opening to something far greater. I didn't know where that light would lead me, but I could no longer pretend nothing had happened. Returning from that flight felt different from any other professional experience I had ever had. It wasn't just about technical reports, performance analyses, or turbulence charts. There was a restlessness that couldn't be contained in spreadsheets. I remembered every second the words that had slipped from my lips almost unconsciously. If there is a God who hears, show me the true path and I will follow it. Never before had I addressed something invisible with such sincerity. It was almost a reflex, a cry that escaped my soul when my mind could no longer hold the situation. In the first days after the flight, I tried to ignore the episode. I justified to myself that the sudden calm had been a meteorological coincidence, that the opening in the clouds was nothing more than an atmospheric anomaly. I repeated those explanations in my head, like an engineer defending calculations before a panel of experts. But the more I tried to rationalize, the more I remembered the silent commitment I had made. I knew it hadn't just been a phrase spoken in desperation. It had been a vow, a moment of surrender, an acknowledgement that I wasn't enough. I carried that memory like a weight. Every time I boarded a new plane, every time I reviewed a project at the office, I felt the same inner voice whispering, "You promised." That word became like a shadow in my days. I could continue designing aircraft, studying manuals, and teaching complex equations to young engineers, but I couldn't escape the echo of that prayer. It was as if the sky itself had recorded that moment and was demanding coherence. I told no one. Neither my wife nor my children nor close colleagues heard about it. I feared appearing fragile, vulnerable, someone who had lost the firmness of reason. Yet inside me a battle was growing. On one side, the man of science, saying faith was nothing more than a psychological crutch. On the other, the memory of the serenity that filled the cabin the instant those words slipped from my lips. No matter how much I wanted to deny it, I couldn't erase the feeling that I had been heard. In daily life, that conflict began to show itself in small gestures. Before, I reacted with sarcasm whenever someone mentioned religion. Now I remained silent, afraid to mock something I no longer completely disbelieved. Before, I grew impatient with Muslim colleagues who stopped to pray at appointed times. Now I watched discreetly, almost admiring the discipline and peace on their faces. I asked myself, what if the same God who hears them had listened to me as well? As months passed, I realized the weight of the promise wasn't a condemnation, but a calling. The more I resisted, the more I felt I was postponing an inevitable encounter. Curiously, in other phases of my life, I had made convenient promises to career, to money, to the relentless pursuit of recognition. I met deadlines, delivered projects, earned million-dollar bonuses, but none of that had brought me peace. That single phrase, spoken at the height of vulnerability, had shifted my entire axis. I began to suffer from insomnia. At night, I would lie down and remember the blaze of light that surrounded us in the clouds. I relived the sensation of being protected by something no engineering calculation could predict. At the same time, came the awareness that I needed to step beyond. The promise demanded an answer. It wasn't just that I had experienced a miracle mid-air, but that I had to let that miracle guide my life on solid ground. One day I sat alone in the design room and stared at a blank drafting table. For the first time in decades, no equations flowed through my mind, only one question: how do I fulfill what I promised? That question marked the start of my search. I didn't know which path would be shown to me, but I was certain I could not go on pretending nothing had happened. The weight of the promise did not crush me. On the contrary, it pushed me forward, like an invisible force demanding that I leave the surface of reason and explore a deeper dimension. I had been challenged not by a supervisor, not by a client, but by the divine mystery itself. And inside me, the conviction grew that there was no turning back. In that instant, I understood that the turbulence in the sky had ended. But inside me, the journey was only beginning. In the days that followed, I resumed my routine with the same rigor as always. Piles of reports, statistical analyses, and endless meetings seemed enough to suffocate any thought outside the technical field. I told myself that everything that had happened in the air could be explained by meteorology, by coincidence, or by simple chance. But when night came and the day's noise died down, the memory of the scene haunted me. The image of the young Muslim quietly reciting, the confidence he gave the crew, and that opening of light over the aircraft were recollections my mind tried to label irrelevant, but my heart stubbornly kept them as signs. The struggle settled inside me like two voices vying for space. The first was the engineer I had become over decades, rational, demanding, used to calculating every risk. That voice said faith was an illusion, that dependence on God was for those who lacked command of logic. The other, quieter voice came from the depths of my soul, reminding me that that night, when I murmured words I never thought I would speak, something real had occurred. It was impossible to deny the serenity that took over the environment after the prayer. Around colleagues, I kept up appearances. I continued to be seen as an objective, focused professional, averse to sentimentality. But inside, a crack widened. I began to watch the company's Muslim staff more closely. I noticed how they paused work at fixed times to pray, how they treated one another with plain, direct respect. Before, I judged those gestures as delays or theatricality. Now, without admitting it to anyone, a sliver of curiosity had grown. What did they know that I didn't? What strength kept them steady amid the pressures of the same environment that consumed me? Family life also began to show signs of this conflict. My wife noticed my distance, but didn't understand the cause. I spent hours awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every detail of the flight. When she asked, I answered evasively, "It's just fatigue." Deep down, it was the fear of confessing that a prayer had shaken my most solid certainties. I feared being seen as someone losing reason, when in truth it was reason that could no longer sustain my inner world. There were nights when I tried to challenge the experience itself. I sat in the living room with technical books, flight simulators, and climate analysis models. I opened pressure charts, consulted meteorological databases to prove to myself that opening in the clouds was nothing more than a natural phenomenon. But the deeper I dug into those calculations, the emptier I felt. I could explain winds, rainfall indexes, and air density, but I could not explain why, at that moment of despair, such a precise answer had appeared. This dilemma consumed me for months. At work, I produced as always. In meetings, I presented solutions, diagrams, and results that impressed. But when I was alone, the promise made in silence returned like a demand. I had said, "Show me the true path, and I will follow it." There was no erasing that. With each day of resistance, the feeling grew that I was pushing open a door that was already ajar, refusing to cross it out of pride. The internal conflict became my greatest turbulence. There were no alarms, no sirens, but inside me the alert was constant. Either I accepted that everything had been coincidence and continued living as before, or I admitted that something beyond human calculation was calling me. I still didn't know which path to choose, but I had one clear understanding. Running away was no longer an option. The decision to seek answers in Islam was not announced publicly. At first, it was just me and a few books hidden among aviation manuals and project folders. I read translations of the Quran during the early hours of the morning when no one else was awake. At work, I kept the same technical posture as always, but inside, something was no longer the same. With each page I read, I felt a new clarity, as if a thread of meaning was finally stitching my questions together. The news, however, didn't take long to leak. A colleague saw me with an English copy of the Quran in my backpack and spread it through the hallways. The reactions were immediate. Some laughed openly. "A renowned engineer believing in miracles? You'll lose your logic, Rajiv." Others, in silence, began to look at me with suspicion, as if I had crossed a dangerous line. Invitations to conferences began to fade. Contracts that once were guaranteed started to be reconsidered. The cost of the search stood before me. At home, the resistance was even more painful. My parents, from a Hindu tradition, couldn't understand how I dared to even consider another spiritual path. My wife, raised in a Christian family, accused me of being in an emotional crisis, not in a sincere discovery. Conversations turned into arguments, and many times I chose silence to avoid damaging family ties further. I felt I was walking the journey alone, but at the same time, I could no longer turn back. With every material or relational loss, something grew inside me that I had never experienced before, a peace that didn't depend on praise or recognition. It was a quiet serenity that appeared when I bent my knees and recited, still timidly, a few supplications I had learned. That feeling couldn't be compared to any medal received at conferences, any technical award or million-dollar contract. It was a peace that required no witnesses. I realized the cost of the search was not only in the distance from people, but also in the battle against my own pride. I, so used to being a reference in my field, had to admit I didn't have all the answers. It was a painful deconstruction, letting faith occupy the space once reserved only for calculations. Each time I read a verse, I understood my life was being dismantled piece by piece, not to destroy me, but to rebuild me on a different foundation. Looking back, I see that each loss was, in truth, an invitation. I lost social invitations, but gained productive silence. I lost contracts, but found time to reflect. I lost human support, but discovered an invisible help that kept me standing. The cost was high, but compared to what I received inside, it seemed small. It was as if God was teaching me that true stability is not found in airplanes, calculations, or reputations, but in a faith that remains even when everything else collapses. Over time, I realized faith was not just an idea or a feeling, but a daily practice shaping every detail of life. Today, I rise before sunrise to make the first prayer, and each of the 5 daily prayers has become a balance point that organizes not only my routine, but also my thoughts. I no longer see engineering only as calculations or fuselages, but as part of a greater service, building responsibly, knowing that everything I do can be an act of worship if done sincerely. Studying the Quran became a constant exercise, not as someone reading to accumulate information, but as someone seeking guidance for real decisions. Each verse brought a new perspective on justice, patience, mercy, and surrender. These values, little by little, reshaped the way I dealt with colleagues, with family, and even with myself. The arrogance that once defined me gave way to gratitude, and that helped me discover a freedom I hadn't known existed. Life did not become free of difficulties, but the difference lies in how I face each obstacle. Where before I saw only failure or injustice, I now find opportunities for growth and learning. The losses I experienced turned into reminders that nothing is permanent except the relationship between man and the Creator. This awareness gives me serenity in the midst of changes that once terrified me. And that is why I share this testimony, because I believe stories like mine can serve as a mirror for others who may be living through similar crises, trying to find answers only in numbers, status, or success. If this story touched your heart and you wish to strengthen this work, consider using the Super Thanks. This contribution is not only financial support, but a way of bringing transformative messages to people I might never reach on my own. It is a simple gesture, but one that helps keep alive the mission of telling stories that inspire faith, courage, and real change. Looking back, I see that each step of this journey brought me to a place I could never have predicted. The engineer who once trusted only in formulas and calculations now recognizes that there are dimensions of life no technical manual can explain. Faith brought meaning, and commitment to God brought balance where before there had only been emptiness. And it is precisely because I believe in the power of a story that I share mine, because I know that often it isn't long speeches or complex theories that touch hearts, but the living experience of someone who found light in the midst of darkness. If this story awakened faith, reflection, or hope, don't keep it only for yourself. Share this video in groups and on social media. A single word can reach someone who is silently searching for answers, and perhaps you will be the instrument for that to happen. By following every detail of this narrative, it shows you are open to reflecting on paths that can transform lives. And if you wish to continue this journey, I invite you to watch the next video. There is always more to learn, more to discover, and more to live when we allow ourselves to listen, reflect, and let the truth find space within us.